Hey guys, it's Dr. Dan, and today I want to have a video that kind of shows you how to solder your components on. Now that we have our custom PCB made, it's time to solder components on. And it's actually pretty fun and pretty easy. If you do it right, your device should work perfectly. And so I have my instrumentation amp tester circuit that I designed here. It's a little bit different than the one I had in the video. This is just more of a practice one. But I'll show you how to solder on some of the components. And some of the things you might notice about this PCB is I forgot to label like which IC is which is the instrumentation amp and which is the op amp. But I looked at my circuit and I know this bottom one's for the op amp, that one's for the instrumentation amp. I also didn't put a plus or minus on the 9-volt battery. So I had to, again, go back to the circuit. And I know on this one, the bottom one is the red and the top one's the black. Okay, so we're going to solder just a couple components in just so you can see how it works. And it's fairly easy to do. So the first thing we'll do is solder on our battery connector. Again, I said the bottom one is red and the top one is black. And so we're just going to put them through there. And then there's a number of things you could do, right? Is if you have a partner who can hold these things in, that's pretty good. If you don't, sometimes you can just bend the wires over to kind of hold them in place. While you solder them. You want to try and make sure though you don't touch anything or else you'll solder something you didn't mean to. So we're just going to use a very small amount of solder here. It doesn't take a lot to put this in. And so I have my soldering iron right here. The one thing you do want to notice is I've cleaned this pretty well. The soldering iron has a nice tip to it. If your soldering iron has been well used and you have an ugly tip that looks like this, that thing will never solder anything, okay? So make sure you have a nice clean tip that is properly tinned and ready to go. And so for soldering, all I'm going to do, so I have my solder, is I'm going to heat up the pad and the wire. And I'm going to just touch a little bit of solder to there. And it will flow nicely onto the pad and wire. And then do the other one. Heat up the pad and the wire. Touch some solder on there, it'll flow nicely onto there. And then we have our soldering completed for this thing, right? It was that easy, and I can check by pulling. So the other thing I'm going to do is make sure I cut off these, the extra leads. So they don't actually, we don't want them touching anything they're not supposed to touch. And the easiest way to fix that is make sure we use our diagonal cutters and just cut off the excess here. Okay, so we have, again, our wire is soldered. Next thing I'll go ahead and do is our op amp. And so the op amp goes in this spot right here. These are sometimes painful to get all 8 pins in at the exact same time. So you have to kind of finagle it. Maybe slightly bend some of the pins in. And so you shouldn't feel bad if you feel like you're fighting this, because you can see I am fighting this also. I'm just going to bend the pins in just a little so they all can go in at the same time. There we go. All right, so I got it through. And so now, again, when you're soldering, maybe you have somebody volunteer to hold it, but it might get kind of hot. So usually what I can do is just like, I'm just going to bend over a couple of those pins. Like one in each corner, and that's enough to hold it in place while I solder. So I have that held in place. Again, I'm just going to heat the pad and the pin, add a little solder, it'll flow in place. Heat the pad and the pin, add a little solder, it'll flow right in place. Pad and pin, add some solder, it'll flow in place. All right, so there's 8 pins. This one's not going so quickly. I can't see if I'm not touching it. There we go. So you need to make sure you heat both the pad and the pin up, and that way it will make sure that the solder sticks to both. Okay, so we have that in there. I'm just going to go ahead and bend that pin back to where it was so it's vertical. You don't really need to cut off those generally. If they're straight in, it's not that big a deal. Okay, so we have that in. I could do the same with my instrumentation amp holder. Right, I could put this in, I could solder it in. Again, I would take this, I would bend some of the pins back and solder it in. So I don't think I need to show you how to do that because it's basically the same exact thing as this op amp holder. But I do want to show you the resistors, right? So for the resistors, you can see I have them labeled so I know what my resistors are. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of bend them and stick these in here. So this is the power 1 resistor, and I have the same exact one for the power 2 resistor. Okay, and really I could do this whole row of resistors I want. And I'm going to do the same thing to hold them in. Again, maybe you have a partner to hold it, but that'll start to get kind of hot. So we'll just kind of bend these pins, or bend these leads out, so it holds the resistors in while I solder. Right, and now I can quickly go through here, touch the pin, touch the pad. Okay, just a little bit of solder is all that's needed. I don't know if you can see how much, or how little solder that is. So I will go ahead and then just cut off these leads. And there we go. We have those components soldered in. So, right, so we would just continue on with the rest of this circuit board, and we would go ahead and finish up. And that's how you solder in your custom circuit board.